Hello and welcome to IO Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. Today we're going to speak about an interesting topic and quite sensitive topic for Ukraine and for Russia and its nationalism. As we live in very dynamic times, many events are going on, many geopolitical events. There is the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, there is also conflict. Nationalism is playing an important role, and I think in some way it's going up on the levels or the scale of our perspectives and understanding how the society works and how the states work together in international affairs. And we don't want to go to some political discussion with my guest today. Rather, we want to learn something from the history. I was just browsing the Cornell University publisher, and I found a book. And the book is called Dynasty Divided, A Family History of Russian and Ukrainian Nationalism. And I thought it would be nice to blend two perspectives, the history and contemporary politics and international affairs, with my guest today, Dr. Fabian Baumann. Hello?
Hi, Martin. Thanks for having me.
Fabian is a research associate at Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies, Heidelberg University. He is historian of Eastern Europe with focus on nationalism, Empire of Russia, on Ukraine, East and Central Europe. Fabian is researching Russia, Ukraine more deeply. And for instance, this book, you can find information dated to 1830. Which is 19th century. So if someone is developing perspective from 19th century till contemporary politics or international affairs, there is an excellent opportunity to learn from the history, and therefore this interview today. So Fabian, let's start with the first question. And can you please introduce your book with few sentences so we know who is Shul'gin family, why this family, and also why you research Ukraine and Russia in terms of nationalism? What was your motivation to do this research?
Yeah, of course. So basically, I became interested in both nationalism and Ukraine in tandem during my studies. I was studying Eastern Europe more broadly, and it occurred to me that Ukraine was a very important testing ground for various theories of nationalism. This is a big country with its own cultural traditions, but at the same time, it is a country that has been politically in the shadow of more powerful neighbors for much of its modern history. So first Poland, then the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union. And Ukrainian national identity in the modern period has been relatively precarious because not only was it besieged by powerful states, but also these were states with relatively closely related cultures and languages. So at times, Polish elites regarded Ukrainian as a dialect of Polish, Russian elites regarded it as a dialect of Russian, and many of the local indigenous Ukrainian elites also assimilated into Polish or Russian elites. But at the same time, there emerged a national movement in Ukraine that ultimately was successful in establishing its own state, even though it was a long and often violent process. Now, who were the Shul'gin and Shul'hyn family? This is a family that lived in Kiev from the 1830s, as you said, until the revolutionary period of 1917 to 1920. Now, what's interesting about this family is that even though they were all of the same both biological and cultural origin, they diverged into two directions. A part of the family became Russian nationalists, hence the Russian name Shul'gin. Another branch of the family turned into the direction of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian nationalism, and called themselves, in Ukrainian pronunciation, Shul'hyn. So for me, this family history, when I first learned of it, and that was in Faith Hillis's book, Children of Rus, appeared to be a fascinating microhistorical prison through which to approach this history of divergence between the self-declared Russian elites and the self-declared Ukrainian elites in the 19th and into the 20th century.
That's fascinating story, and I'm glad you found this family because it's always good to have some historical background when you have research. So that's excellent. In your book, you describe nationalism as a deliberate choice. And I'm interested in how did you distinguish between ideological shifts driven by personal convictions and those influenced by pressures like state repression or exile? And we know that this often is shaping your national narratives and how you see the world, how you see the conflict, for instance, as we have at the moment, the war in Ukraine.
Yes, so maybe to first briefly introduce from an example what I mean by this. So, as I said, the members of the Shul'gin and Shul'hyn family all shared an ethnic and cultural background. So, the reason that some of them came to see themselves as Russians and others as Ukrainians cannot be because they were inherently different in terms of ethnicity. Um, the reason I came to see their nationalism as a political choice is that if you look at the individual biographies, especially of the people who made these, who took these paths in one or the other direction, there were usually concrete political reasons, reasons that went beyond simply the identification with one's native country or culture. So the founder of the family was a Russian Imperial patriot, a Russian nationalist, at least in the early variety during the 1860s. But his nephew, a man called Yakov Shul'gin or Yakov Shul'hyn, turned to Ukrainian nationalism. Now, why did he do that? He was a student at Kyiv University during the 1870s, in a time when populism, so what is called narodnichestvo in Russian or narodnitstvo in Ukrainian, when populism was the dominant ideology. So he identified strongly with the culture of the regional peasants, and these peasants spoke Ukrainian dialects mostly, because most of them were illiterate. And so people like Yakov Shul'gin became simultaneously socialists and saw themselves as servants to this Ukrainian peasant people and as therefore also as members of a Ukrainian nation. So he then learned Ukrainian himself, having grown up as a Russian speaker. He married a woman with close tie to the village. He educated his children in Ukrainian. So there is this element of deliberate choice. But as you correctly say, of course, these choices interacted with external conditions. And in a Russian imperial state, the incentives were always there to see oneself as a Russian, because Ukrainians, after all, had few obstacles to their social mobility in terms of nationality if they agreed to see themselves as Russians. So the incentives were stacked one way during that period, and only people with, say, the will to be in opposition and to go through hardship would choose Ukraine. This could then change at different periods. And if you, for instance, take the interwar emigration, when Ukrainian emigre institutions formed, such as the Ukrainian Free University or the Ukrainian government in exile, there could also be material incentives for people to see themselves as Ukrainians because they could get work in these institutions, etc.
When we speak about nationalism, Fabian, I'm just thinking: did people understand nationalism in the same way as we do today?
This is a difficult question, I would say. I mean, in Russian and Ukrainian discourse, the term nationalism itself is used relatively rarely until the early 20th century. In 1908, a Russian nationalist party establishes itself. By the time of the First World War, many Ukrainian nationalists also start openly calling themselves nationalists. Before that, most people would rather speak of themselves as populists, as patriots, perhaps as statists, so like государственники in Russian. I personally use a broad definition of nationalism. I don't only use nationalism as a designation for hardcore, integral chauvinist nationalists. when I speak of nationalists, I mean people who see the world's population as divided into socio-cultural groups that they call nations, and who see these nations as the legitimate basis for state sovereignty. So people who see nations as sort of existing communities and communities that are linked to political sovereignty. So basically, I build upon the classics here: Benedict Anderson, Ernest Gellner, etc. And of course, this is nowadays an outlook that most people share because we live in a world of nation states. But that was not the case in the 19th century, when, for instance, many of the aristocratic politicians of the empire would not have thought in these categories. So I definitely use the term nationalist for people in the late 19th century who would probably have used different self-designations.
How did you ensure that your analysis of family and identities and everything that you are writing about in that book remained sort of sensitive to each era's specific geopolitical context? This is a quite difficult task.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I am doubtless dealing with different eras in this book. I mean, as you say, the book starts in the 1830s, but that has more of a sort of a prologue quality. I would say like the key area of research is the 1860s to the 1920s. And these are doubtless at least, I would say, like 5 different periods. So the reform era of the 1860s, when sort of a public sphere in the Russian Empire was only beginning to develop. Then the late 19th century, the phase of Alexander III and Nicholas II, when sort of imperial ideologues increasingly blended imperial and national ideologies. And then the sort of semi-constitutional period from 1905 to 1914, when public politics became permitted, when parties were formed, when the press had much greater liberty than before. The revolutionary period, or rather maybe the continuum of crisis from the start of the First World War to the end of the Civil War in the former Russian Empire, when everything was in flux, when conflicts were militarized, and then finally the emigration in Central and Western Europe, where again you have completely different conditions for politics. But I mean, I am a historian after all. I am used to thinking in terms of periodization, and as you mentioned before, I mean, these are just the conditions for discourse, for conflict, for biographical paths that we need to keep in the back of our minds. And what I found is that while the development of discourses was gradual, and sometimes the things people talked about were surprisingly similar, say in the revolutionary period, to what they had been in the 1860s, it is the practices that could change much more abruptly with each change in conditions. And I'll give just one example. After the revolution of 1905, the Ems Ukaz, so the Tsarist decree that had prohibited publication of press and of most other things, really, in the Ukrainian language, simply fell by the wayside. And it was suddenly possible to publish about all matter of topics in Ukrainian. And that obviously immensely changed the practice of how Ukrainian nationalists mobilized and how they reached out. So in terms especially of political practice, it is these watersheds that enormously mark change and mark change in an abrupt way.
How did focusing on one family influence your understanding of the nationalism? Because people might say we have many books about geopolitics and many books about the history of Russia and Ukraine, and those books are usually writing about the era, like a particular time or some government or stuff like that. But you're writing about one family. How this can bring us sort of better perspective or different perspective?
So when I first started to get interested in this topic of Russian-Ukrainian relations, I wrote a master's thesis about sort of debates in the early 20th century. And I chose a more traditional approach, mostly looking at political debates in the State Duma and in the press. But after finishing this thesis, I ended up somewhat disappointed because I had the impression that I was only describing the quarrels of people who were talking past one another. So they had chosen their sides, and they thought within the categories established by their side. No Russian nationalist by 1910, say, would have convinced his Ukrainian opponents that Ukraine was a part of Russia, or vice versa. So what I wanted to do with this book was to get down at the human level and to look at people who are only in the process of choosing a side. And I think it is this this is the novelty of this book mostly, that it really looks at, of course, taking a very small sample of persons, the members of this family, some of their associates and friends and colleagues, but a very small sample of people, of educated people, moreover. But I do think that I managed to reconstruct the process of choosing a side in more detail than previous studies. And this is ultimately also the question in bigger studies, right? Why does one state or nation building project manage to attract the support of people? Now, my book is definitely not the final answer to this question, but I do think that it is a step ahead, precisely because it looks at these personal trajectories.
And I also enjoyed following stories of particular characters in the book, which is sometimes it's more complicated, I must honestly say, but still you can see the lines of the development of ideas and thoughts. And I think that's quite important, and it's something different than when you read a book about general conditions in Ukraine or Russia. I have one question about the ideological splits within the family, within Shul'gin or Shul'hyn family, and how this reflects the broader generational divides in Russia and Ukraine. Is it even possible to apply some implications for today?
The split between the Russian and Ukrainian sides of the families happened in the 1870s. And it was a split between a conservative pro-Russian uncle and his Narodnik nephew. So with a nod to Turgenev, I also named this subchapter Uncles and Nephews. And there is, of course, something reminiscent of these famous generational splits in the Russian imperial intelligentsia, in that on the one hand, you have sort of a pro-imperial reform era conservative, and his nephew is sort of part of the Narodnik critics of the empire. Then in the following generation, so when we look at people, so the Narodniki in the region were mostly born in the 1840s and 1850s. When you look at the following generation, the ones born in the late 1870s and the 1880s, for them, their guiding ideology as they matured politically was no longer Russian or Ukrainian style Narodnik thought. It was Marxism. This was the turn of the century when intellectuals in the Russian Empire engaged with Marxism mostly. And this brought with itself new conceptions of nationality and new political practices, new alliances, etc. Interestingly, in the conservative Russian side of the family, you see a similar shift from anti-populism with sort of pro-state ideology that directs itself against the ideas of Narodnik-style populism, to anti-Marxism, which is also often connected with a more anti-Semitic component. When we look at today, in both Ukraine and Russia, I don't see this clear of a generational political split. I would say that in Ukraine, one important difference is certainly between those who experienced the Soviet Union as adults and those who didn't. Especially before 2022, you could see that among the older population in Ukraine, and this is something that sociological surveys showed, conceptions of Slavic brotherhood, of close cultural similarity between Russia and Ukraine were stronger than they were among the younger generation. But this is also something that has largely fallen by the wayside after the all-out attack of Putin on Ukraine in 2022. So nowadays, I don't see these generational split as similarly dominant.
Right. You emphasize on families, so I think we can develop few pillars of nationalism when comparing the family and state-driven nationalism. And this is something very important because sometimes you have a movement within the state, and then there is a surprise effect that suddenly you have like a group of nationalists together. They are demonstrating and they are protesting against something, and it's a surprise for the society.
Many theorists of nationalism have made in various terms a distinction between sort of state-centered and counter-state nationalism. There are several tendencies here. Nationalism that is built in support of an existing state tends to be on the conservative side, and Russian nationalism has historically been a prime example for this. Sort of trying to use an existing state for its goals, trying also to change the existing state to be more representative of the nation. Counter-state nationalisms, so nationalisms that try to establish a new state by separation from an existing one, have tended to be more revolutionary, have tended to align more with socialist goals. And here in the 19th century, Ukrainian nationalism is a perfect example of it. Now, as I have hinted before, Ukrainian nationalism was operating under difficult circumstances in the 19th century. The Russian Empire made it impossible to publish a press in Ukrainian, but it also, in general, punished people suspected of being Ukrainian nationalists. It could send them to Siberia, or it could exclude them from state employment. Possibilities to propagate Ukrainian nationalism were very restricted. Now, as I show in my book, what the Ukrainian nationalists in Kiev did is they retreated into the private sphere. They held gatherings in their apartments where they either played concerts, had theater shows in Ukrainian, had poetry readings, but also political discussions. Women who were not at the same time employed by the state. Many of these men were, in fact, in their day jobs, teachers, university lecturers, or even bureaucrats. The women were not. The women could dedicate themselves fully to activism. The women were also the educators of the future generation of Ukrainians. It was often the women who knew the Ukrainian language better than the men. So these women were at the same time ideologically idealized as the mothers of the nation, if you will, but also they had this real role in organizing and educating, and in using their families as a vehicle for nationalism. Now, Russian nationalists didn't have to do all of that. They also partially did, but they didn't have to, because Russian nationalism could really be propagated anywhere, in the press, in the theater, with patriotic operas, etc., because it, to an extent, aligned with the goals of the imperial state. And so it is not surprising that the family did not have as crucial a role. It did for the Russian Shul'gins, especially in terms of organizing their newspaper business, but it was not the only pillar of the Russian nationalist mobilization.
And when you mention, and that's quite interesting, how the Ukraine was at the time, and how those nationalists were meeting privately, there is the sort of logical question: was there any society that was grouping those people together, and there was some sort of manifesto or some political outcome of those meetings? Because to meet privately is one thing, but then you must in some way send a message or to do something politically. Otherwise, the nationalism would be hidden forever, and you wouldn't even research that because there was no impact. So how was that sort of process at the time?
So, I mean, for a long time, these meetings remained really secret. There was a group called the Kiev Hromada, the community, but they restricted themselves to cultural work, for instance, to composing a Ukrainian dictionary, because all openly political manifestations would have been very risky. And their example in this way of working, they took from the Polish nationalists, what in Poland was called praca organiczna, organic work, sort of, working for the cultural advancement of the nation when politics is impossible. Now, around the turn of the century, some political groupings were formed. There was a secret party called the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party that was active in the revolution of 1905. There was also an overarching cultural organization called the General Ukrainian Organization, Zahalna Ukraińska Organizacja. And then after 1905, some activists carried Ukrainian national ideas into the parties, for instance, the Liberal Cadet Party. But I would still argue that Ukrainian nationalism only truly reached the masses after the revolution of 1917, when several Ukrainian parties were established, among them the relatively strong Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionary Party that actually met with great electoral success, especially in the countryside, and that sent out its agitators to actually talk to the peasants. It was in 1917 that after decades of this secretive work, the Ukrainian nationalists in Kiev and elsewhere were prepared to actually take power when imperial power imploded, basically.
Imagine that you are a nationalist and you want to progress in your thoughts either in Ukraine or Russia. And I am a teacher or someone who is senior in that sort of debate. What was the source of thoughts for both sides at the time? Because this is quite important. What I'm going to tell you, you will follow and you will basically do.
I mean, if you look at Ukrainian nationalism in the 1870s, and what they were reading, as far as we can, reconstruct from memoirs and the like, this was not so different from what the Russian radical intelligentsia was reading. So they were reading sort of cutting-edge European science and social thought. So, Darwin, Herbert Spencer, Marx was beginning to penetrate. They were reading the writings of the Russian radicals, Chernyshevsky, Pisarev, and so on, with all their revolutionary ideas of sort of popular sovereignty and the like. And then they were also reading sort of the local intellectual traditions, especially the historians working on Ukraine's history. So that would be Mykola Kostomarov, Volodymyr Antonovich, Mikhailo Drahomanov, who was still a young man at the time. Also older ethnographers like Mikhailo Maximovich, who had collected Ukrainian folk songs and the like. So for the Ukrainians, it was, I would say, a mixture of readings on Ukrainian cultural and historical traditions with sort of European and Russian cutting-edge science for the period. The Russian nationalists of the time were conservatives, and accordingly, their readings would have been somewhat more conservative. They would probably have read more historians of the Russian statist school. But many of them were equally well informed about progressive works, if only to polemicize with them. So for instance, Dmitry Pichno in Russian, one of the leaders of the Russian branch in the family, was an economist, and he was known for teaching seminars about and against Marxist theory at Kyiv University. So even though he was anything but a Marxist, he would have been informed about Marxist social theory as well. And generally, you can say that in the 19th century, these debates between Russian and Ukrainian nationalists, controversial as they were, still took place within an all-imperial intellectual framework. And someone like Kostomarov, perhaps the most important Ukrainian historian of the 19th century, was at the same time a professor at St. Petersburg University and, was a famous figure among Russian students as well. So there was still a common discourse, and it was only really after the revolution that kind of all dialogue between the two sides ceased.
That's very important to know, because to spread ideas in the era of the internet and social networks, it's completely different what was in the past, when people were waiting for a book, maybe for 5 months, maybe sometimes for a year, till the book comes. You mentioned the role of women. Can we compare what was the main contribution in Ukraine and Russia when we speak about the women in nationalist movement?
Since the Ukrainian national movement was ideologically so close to populism, to sort of peasant-directed socialism, these families also absorbed the progressive ideas about women's roles. So they, for instance, took the education of women very seriously. The eldest daughter of the Ukrainian branch of the Shul'hyn family, for instance, became a mathematician and wrote one of the first mathematics textbooks in Ukrainian. Women, as I said, were also idealized for their role in the family and in educating future generations. And there's this general assumption in European nationalism that somehow women are more closely connected to the soil, that they have like a natural connection to national culture, etc. But in its concrete incarnation, this also meant that it was often the women in the families who taught their children about Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian music, etc. So really, their role in this Ukrainian national movement, especially in this time of repression and privacy, cannot be overestimated. They were really the prime movers of the secretive milieu in Kiev. If I look at the Russian side of the family, it's a bit more complicated. These were more conservative people, and so both the men and the women tended to share the attachment to more traditional gender roles. So most of them would have seen a woman's role as relatively removed from politics and more linked to traditional ways of family making. However, that did not mean that in practice they did stay away from politics. And in the third chapter of the book, I describe how every family member in the Russian branch of the family entered political propaganda and newspaper making. So Lina Mogilyevskaya, one of the women, was de facto the manager of the newspaper Kievlyanin that the family edited. Another woman, Yekaterina Shul'gina, was a journalist, political journalist for the paper, even though, and that again is telling, she always wrote under a masculine pseudonym. So even when she sort of had this political agency, she would somehow try to hide it and to keep her female self out of these public debates. But women were involved in both sides, and just because men are often more visible in nationalist movements, that doesn't mean that women did not contribute. I think a closer look at most nationalist movements in Europe will reveal that women were activists in them. Perhaps a bit less public facing, but they were always there in the associations, in the organizations.
The political evolution of the Shul'gin family mirrors the tension between the regional identity and imperial loyalty. in some way. How might this dynamic help us to understand that what we see the contemporary struggle in Ukraine between aligning with the West and maintaining ties with Russia? And based on your research, of course, can we make some sort of generalization of that implications, or is it part by part? Because we know that Ukraine has many regions. It's not only like one region.
Key fact about 19th century Ukraine, the part ruled by Russia, is that its elites were genuinely split. Some of them saw great opportunities for their region within the Russian Empire, and the Russian side of the Shul'gin family would be an example for that. There was also, at the time, of course, not this kind of geopolitical alternative. There was absolutely no realistic way until the revolution of 1917, in which Ukraine could have sort of, entered the sphere of a different empire. The exception, of course, being the very west of Ukraine, which was part of Austria-Hungary. Only with the revolution, and especially the last year of the First World War, 1918, was there an opportunity for Ukrainian elites to enter the sphere of Germany, an opportunity that sort of arose again during the Second World War. And there is, of course, this Russian myth that is frequently heard in the Putin propaganda, that Ukrainian nationalism has always been kind of a conspiracy led by Western powers to tear Ukraine away from Russia. So, if you read the Russian propaganda, whether the old one from the early 20th century or the contemporary one, the narrative is always kind of, first it was the Poles who tried to tear Ukraine away, then it was the Austrians, then it was the Germans, and now it's the Americans. Or the EU, choose as you will. In my view, historically, the facts have been the other way around. It is sort of when there were local movements that were dissatisfied with Russian rule historically, that at some points Western powers have been able to fill this gap and these local nationalist Ukrainian movements have latched onto neighboring powers. In fact, they were mostly disappointed by these powers then. The alliance with Germany was short-lived twice. And even today, sort of the West's support for Ukraine to leave the Russian sphere of influence is kind of half-hearted. So I here clearly see the agency locally. With regard to regions, of course, the further west you go, the stronger has been the cultural pull of Western neighboring countries. And the link to Poland has always remained strong, for instance, in Galicia, not only in the interwar period when it was part of Poland, but even during the late Soviet period, there were stronger contacts that then, especially in the perestroika time, also sort of led to an influence of movements such as Solidarność on Western Ukraine. And obviously in the easternmost regions of Ukraine, say the Donbass, where there was also a lot of immigration from Russia, cultural ties have been stronger with Russia than elsewhere.
Fabian, in your book, you use two theoretical concepts or frameworks, and I would like you to clarify why you use them. And the first one from those concepts is nation as a category of practice. So why this concept? What does it mean in your context, in your research? And can we use this concept today when we differentiate between the national identities of Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, yes, we can. This is a concept that I've taken from the sociologist Rogers Brubaker. Many of your audience will be familiar, I guess. And he bases this on a type of praxeology as practiced by Pierre Bourdieu. Now, what does he mean by calling nation a category of practice? He means that a nation as he puts it, is not a thing in the world, it is a perspective on the world. So a nation does not exist in the same way that a city or a mountain exists. These things are there, they are physically there. No one can claim they are not there. Whereas a nation is something that comes into existence because of people's practices, because people believe that there is a nation, because people talk about there being a nation, and because people act accordingly. So for instance, in their associational practices, but also, enacting nationhood can also have such everyday features as, for instance, in Ukraine, wearing like the embroidered peasant shirts, the vyshyvanka, right? This is something that started in the 19th century. Sort of people symbolically dress in a way to express membership in a nation that they believe in. This to me is a very useful concept if we want to avoid the image of two stable blocks moving at each other, and if we want to find out how actually this duality between Ukrainian and Russian culture, nationhood, etc., developed in sort of a game of back and forth, right? There's always reactions to the other side's actions. Now, today, of course, as I've said before, we live in a world of nation states. And today, by law, almost everyone in the world is a citizen of a nation state. And so nations today exist more clearly in a formal way than they did in the 19th century. At least they exist as sort of bodies of citizens of one state. But still, nation also remains a category of practice. If you look, for instance, at Ukraine since the invasion by Russia in 2022, nation still functions as a mobilizing device. People go to the front lines, or people, somehow manage to live through the constant bombings of Ukrainian cities. And they refer to this concept of nationhood. They believe in the right of nations to self-determination. And again, it remains a category of practice because people believe in it and people act according to it. And I think in this sense, it still remains a pertinent question to ask in a Brubakerian way, sort of, what do people mean when they talk of the Ukrainian nation? How do people enact nationhood? In what situations in life is Ukrainian nationality relevant to them? These are still the more precise questions than questions that reify the nation. For instance, if you ask, what is the will of the Ukrainian nation? Well, this is not a question that can really be answered, can it? I mean, not in its totality. You can describe tendencies, but never will all Ukrainians want the same thing. So I think it is still also for political scientists in the present worth thinking of nation as a category of practice.
The second concept I'm interested in, I think it's important to explain, is national indifference.
Yes, so national indifference is a concept that is also related, I think, to the Brubakerian school of thinking on nationalism, but it also goes back to older historical works, such as the classic Peasants into Frenchmen by Eugene Weber from the 1970s. But probably the best-known writer on national indifference is the historian Tara Zara, who has worked mostly on Bohemia. And what she managed to show there, working on the late Habsburg and interwar period, is that there were a high amount of people who did not, even in the high phases of nationalist conflict, clearly choose one or the other affiliation. People either continued to self-identify in a pre-modern way as, say, inhabitants of a village or a particular city, so local instead of national identification. They saw themselves primarily as Catholics, they simply were unpolitical and, would go to eat free food at the German beer hall one evening, and then on the other day would go to a party of the Czech nationalists where they might get free beer or something. So there was opportunism as well. And this is a concept linked to the previous one in the sense that it helps us understand that nations were not monolithic blocks. Many people were in between. And also, a lot of the political competition between nationalists was about winning the hearts and souls of precisely these undecided and indifferent people. And in this sense, it is also relevant to my work because obviously the people I write about were not nationally indifferent. These were nationalist activists. At some point, they chose a national affiliation, and then they dedicated much of their work to defending this nationalism. But it is important to keep in mind that many of the peasants of Ukraine were probably not particularly interested in either Russian or Ukrainian nationalism in the 19th century. They may have had their cultural identity that they distinguished from certain other groups, say Jewish traders or Polish landlords. They may have had this socio-ethnic identification as Orthodox peasants. And they may or may not have thought of themselves as Ukrainians. Many of them were still kind of malleable, if you will, in a national way. And there are examples from regions such as Volhynia, where in 1907, many peasants voted for Russian monarchist parties, and then during the revolution voted for Ukrainian socialist parties. Clearly, for many of them, economic concerns were paramount, and they could still be convinced by one or the other side in the nationalist conflict.
There is one question that I think it's interesting, and that's the personal assumptions about nationalism as a strategic choice. Was there any part of that family line, Shul'gin family line, that changed your perspective, that you thought something at the beginning and then you said like, maybe I could or I can reconsider this?
I mean, the Shul'gin and Shul'hyn family, they're not only politically interesting, right? I mean, as you might have seen in the book, these were relatively strange people with many surprising aspects, even of their private lives. I think what was something that I realized during the research process is that political mobilization for nationalists could be extremely abrupt and could happen very, very quickly. So there is one member of the family, Ekaterina Shul'gina, who describes in her memoirs how she came to Russian nationalist politics during the war between Russia and Japan in 1904 and during the Russian Revolution of 1905. So she didn't care about politics at all before then. But when she saw Russian statehood and nationhood and the monarchy endangered, first by an external opponent, Japan, and then by internal opponents, revolutionaries, socialists, she would describe them often as Jewish, as was normal. It was normal at the time for Russian nationalists to connect socialism and Judaism. And then suddenly she sort of turned rightward. She became a convinced Russian nationalist. She became an activist. And I think sort of reading her memoirs alerted me to the fact that this political mobilization can be very sudden. And this, again, once more led me back to Rogers Brubaker, who has also written about nationalism as an event, not just as a steady growth over the decades, but as something that can sort of explode in a very short moment and that can suddenly become pertinent to everybody's lives. And I think we see similar examples in the present, right? I mean, Ukraine as a nation state has been repeatedly attacked from outside, and there has been a strong nationalization of many sectors of the population who were relatively indifferent before.
That's also very important to note that the current situation and the situation in the past, we can always find some similarities because the past and the present, it's also about the families, about the leaders, about the politics. So I think that's quite important to know. There is one question, and that's come from my students, that your book was published in 2023. So it's 1 year plus minus. What was the impact in Ukraine and Russia? How the book was received? Do you have any insights from scholars, maybe your colleagues? Because this is quite sensitive topic, especially in the times of war.
So in Ukraine and among Ukrainian colleagues, I have had very positive feedback overall. I was at times a bit worried that people, might misinterpret the book, because if you read it carelessly, you could think that what I am saying is sort of, Ukrainian culture and nationality was artificially constructed by a few intellectuals. Now, that is not at all what I'm saying, but a careless reader could misunderstand the argument as this. But this has not happened at all. Actually, Ukrainian colleagues have been very generous in their feedback. And the book is currently being translated into Ukrainian and will hopefully be published in Lviv next year. And I'm very excited about this. I'm very happy about the Shul'gins and Shul'hyns returning home, so to speak. And I will be excited to see what a Ukrainophone readership thinks of the book. With reactions in Russia, it's more difficult to tell. Obviously, the situation being as it is, academic contacts with Russia have suffered. So the only Russian colleagues I have had feedback from are ones in exile in the West. I have not to date read any review in a Russian journal. Perhaps some will still appear. I do think that this would be an important book for Russian historians to read as well, because I think that aspects of this book can explain some of the divergences in historical development between Russia and Ukraine, even though it still treats a period when when Ukraine was very much still part of the Russian imperial space. So I think that this is a book that can actually build a bridge between the historiographies on Ukraine and on Imperial Russia. But to date, I have not heard much in terms of reactions from inside Russia.
The last question for today's interview, Fabian. Researching nationalism is always challenging. It's always sort of skating on a thin ice because there are many actors involved in this topic. For junior researchers, maybe students and the audience, when they want to research nationalism, what is the most important to do and what is the most important challenge that you faced in the past and I think also in the present?
I think what was relatively peculiar about my project is that I gave the same amount of space to both sides in an emerging conflict. Most studies tend to either look at Russian nationalism mostly or at Ukrainian nationalism, and mostly to cast the other side only in terms of the protagonist's opponents. Now, obviously, my perspective is not complete. For instance, the Polish perspective appears precisely in this way, just as the opponents of Russian and Ukrainian nationalists. But I was dealing mostly with this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and I think what was a key challenge for me is to take both sides seriously. Now, in the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I think it is pretty clear with which side I sympathize. I sympathize with Ukrainians' rights to self-determination, with their right to living in a democratic state, and I definitely do not sympathize with Putin's autocracy and kleptocratic regime. But when I was looking at the 19th century, even though there were some disagreeable aspects, especially of Russian nationalism, even at the time, say their anti-Semitism, their social elitism, it was very important to me to understand why people came to think of Russian nationalism in Ukraine as a solution to the population's problems. So this to me is the key challenge whenever working on political history, to empathize with the protagonists, to try and see the world through their eyes. But then when you write, of course, again, to take your distance and to once more become an outside observer. So it is this balance between empathy and distance that I think is crucial when writing about historical conflicts.
Fabian, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and ideas that you shared with us. It's a very sensitive topic, and I think no matter which country, the nationalism is always about people, leaders, families, as you wrote in your book. I would like to recommend the book because it's open source, so everyone can download the book and read your thoughts, follow the story of the Shul'gin family. And also I would like to encourage people to research nationalism, because it's not the problem of the past. I think it's problem of people, no matter which time we are recording the episode or which time we are living in this world. So Fabian, thank you again for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you so much for having me, Martin.